I'm going to start out doing is a couple pen blanks. There's typical mold size. There'll be 10 ounces of resin for the two of them. I'm using Alumilite resin. This is the clear. We typically use the clear slow. It gives you a longer window for working and mixing the mica powders in. So, anybody got any particular colors they would like to see?
Oh, yeah. Hit record.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Oh, let's see. How about a nice bright blue? Throw. Oh, my wife's gonna hate me for that. Blue and yellow. I don't have any white. I didn't bring any dye. We'll put a little ocean blue. The dye is going to give it a translucent effect, where the mica powders, that'll give it an opaque effect. And they have like a metal shimmer to them.
I would get up a little farther.
And I'll go over all the different equipment that I'm using after we do the casting and go through our monthly meeting. This way, the casting can sit in a pot for the time under pressure to break down the air bubbles while we do our normal meeting. So I'm going to start out, I have a scale here, it's zeroed out with the cup. And I know I need 10 ounces for the two molds. So I'll pour in, Alumilite is 1-to-1 ratio. So I'll pour in 5 ounces after I cut the top off. I brought brand new bottles. So.
Cut the other top too, where you got the knife on.
I already did that one. I just forgot to get this one. It was one of the last minute things. Probably could pour it out, it'd be just as easy. And typically, when I'm doing multiple cups or molds at home, I'll take and write on the cup the number of ounces that I'm pouring. And this is something that you want to be exact with. A lot of people use a gram scale to pour with. It's a little more accurate than the ounces. So what I'll do is take the mica powders and get them into my smaller cups. I find it easier to mix it in the bigger cup for the A and B. Couple things that does, you can see the resin in it, and you'll see swirls as you're mixing. And once all the swirls disappear, you know you have it thoroughly mixed. The mica powders that I'm using, they're from Oakbrook Supplies, and they're called Color Fusion powders. They have some really, really nice colors. I'm really happy with the color selection that I'm getting out of them. The dyes are from Alumilite, and they are very concentrated. It doesn't take a lot of dye when you're mixing this stuff.
Show that to the camera, how much you put on that stick.
It's very little, and what I'm going for is a translucent effect in the blank. So you'll see the blue with the mica powder, and you'll get swirls where it'll give it depth in your blank, and it gives it a really cool effect. So now that I have that done, I'll take and mix my other half of the resin. zero off my scale again, and I'll put 5 ounces of this into it. It's 10 ounces total for the 2 molds. An individual mold is 5 ounce. And for the 2 parts, you want 5 ounces of each. And you can see how the resin has a little bit of a opaque to it. And as you mix it, and I'm not worried about introducing any type of air bubble to it, so it's better if I bring it down here.
Yep.
Because we're going to cast it under pressure. What the pressure is going to do is actually crush the air bubbles to a microscopic level. And this resin has a 7-minute working time. I like to set a timer. It's just a cheap little kitchen timer. So I know roughly how much time I have before it starts to set up. And I also use an infrared thermometer. One of the things when you're mixing your resins and your powders, if you take and mix it and pour it into your molds right away, your colors are going to mute together. And the blue and yellow will make a green. And so you want solid definition between your colors. And what you do is start to gauge the temperature of the resin. Some people say 95, 98 degrees is optimal. Depending on how fast and where your pressure pot is set up and how your shop is set up for it, you can push it up to 100, 101 degrees and still get your molds into the pot before it starts to set up. And once it's in the pot and under pressure, what you're going to do, and you can see that's pretty clear except for the air bubbles. And like I said, you're not worried about the air bubbles casting on your pressure. So I'm just going to pour off roughly a third. I know that the top of the rings on the cup is roughly 3 ounces. So I'll go a little bit more on these. I'll leave a little less for the translucent dye. Don't do that. I still got time. So right now, you can see that's pretty clear as far as the color of that. And it didn't take much at all.
It really looked like you only had about 2 drops.
That's all that was in there. It's
Don't answer the phone while you're doing this.
Doug, if you could do me a favor and get that rack out of my pressure pot.
Need this out?
Yeah. Thank you. With the resin too, you want to watch your temperature. I try to get my shop, the casting room, up to about 70 degrees. Yeah. Right now the resin's reading about 74, 75 degrees. So still got a little bit of time. Even though my timer says it's only got a minute left, I'll let that go at least to get it up to 85. It may take a little bit longer, but once it starts to go, it's going to go fast. And you don't want to be messing around trying to pour your pen blanks and try trying to get stuff into your pot when it's starting to set up.
Is the stirring, once you got it all mixed, does that accelerate the heat?
No, because it's a chemical reaction, so once you have that thoroughly mixed, it's not gonna speed it up. It's one of them things just to make sure that you do have it thoroughly mixed and that your mica powders are thoroughly broken down.
So how hot will that stuff get?
The last I've ever seen a reading was 105 degrees, and I didn't have time then to get it into the pot. It set up before, so how hot it actually gets during the curing process, that I don't know because it's in a pressure pot.
It'll depend on how big a volume you've got.
Yeah.
The bigger you've got, the faster.
Quicker it-
Yes, yeah, yep.
And if you've got like a gallon going, you can get the whole thing, it'll actually start smoking.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I know when I was doing that stuff, I mean, you want to get it in the pot right away. You know, those were probably two of our bigger pours. And that's one of the things that, you know, it's fun to do because my wife and I, we get to do it together. You know, you start mixing, like some of the pen blanks that I have out in the back room for sale, the abalone shell blank. There's 6 different colors mixed into that. So you're really hustling to get that mix, you know, your 6 different colors and get it into a mold before your time. So right now we're up to roughly 83. That one's taking a little bit longer yet. That's only 80. So. Plus, with the molds too, the HPDE molds are really nice. I do use a mold release for them. You don't need to though. As long as you're not scratching up the inside of your mold. I haven't had a pen blank yet where I've had to beat it out with a hammer. I mean, I'll take and tap it on the table, and I put a screwdriver in here, pop the end out, and the blank will fall out for you. They're really good stuff. During the second part of the demonstration, I'll have handouts to give out, and the different suppliers that I use that I've been comfortable with and enjoy their product are on that handout. So what we're going to do when you're pouring is pour a little bit of each color in. And there's different techniques for different ways, different effects. And if you think casting is a neat and controlled process, you're kidding yourself, because it seems like no matter how much you try to be neat, you're going to make more of a mess.
So don't do it in the wife's kitchen.
Yeah, yeah.
Says the wife.
And larger molds help too. Doing these small pen blank molds, you're going to make a mess. So.
There's no special order with that translucent you put in?
No.
Versus the micro,
No,
wherever. How many blanks do you get per mold?
this will make one pen blank. The larger one here, and I'll go through a lot of that stuff in the second half. What I'm going to do now is just give it a little bit of a swirl effect. By plunging that stick down into it, you're going to create different effects in the resin.
So you can't actually ever duplicate one that you really like, can you?
Yes and no. Some of the guys that have been casting for a very long time, they can come pretty close to what they cast. They'll write down every ounce of resin that they put in, they'll write down how much of the mica powders they put in. So everything is exactly the same. Some guys, they'll pour through funnels, some will make little slides. So that way, as it comes down through the funnel or through the slide, it's creating the same effect for them. Right now, I'm gonna take and turn that up to 45 pounds.
No, I was just thinking you should get up there, yeah.
There you go. So that's the casting part of it.
Is that a big pot or that's a portion?
That's what, a paint pot, it's been converted over.
Oh,
Okay, and we'll get into a little bit of that.
I got a big pot, I use one, so.
Yep. And I'll preach the safety now, and I'll preach it again when I do the second half. You're essentially making an explosive device there. It's under pressure. Yeah, it's under pressure. You want to be careful with it. You want to make sure all your fittings are good. Go over it. Once a week, I look at anything to make sure there's no cracks in it. Because my large 5-gallon pot, I crank that up to 75 pounds of pressure. I don't want that lid flying off of that, you know, so it's one of them things. Safety is number one with these. You want, it's a Harbor Freight, okay? It's not certified for anything. It's not certified for 10 pounds of pressure. You know, so don't believe, oh, somebody said I could take it up to 60 pounds. Don't believe it.
That's why you're teaching the wife too in the pressure pot.
Yeah. So, we'll continue on with the.
Any other questions before we continue on about this part of it?
Okay, like I said, at the end of the first part of the demonstration, when you're doing casting, you look at it as, oh, it's just mixing a couple of things together with some dyes, powders, whatever. It's not very dangerous. But again, I'm gonna emphasize the safety factor of it. People have had allergic reactions to different resins. Some people, when they cut it, they, have respiratory reactions. So it's something to always be mindful of, that when you're doing it, take the necessary precautions. You're dealing with something that's under pressure with your pressure pots. Check it out, look it over, make sure everything looks satisfactory on it. Don't say, it's okay, it'll be good enough. When I cast, I always have latex gloves. Myself, my wife, even when she's out in the room casting with me, we don't have any type of allergic reaction to it, but we still take the necessary precautions with latex gloves. Always wear safety glasses, a well-ventilated room. Alumilite doesn't have a strong odor to it. The PR resin, polyester resin, from what I've heard, I've never cast with that has a very strong odor to it. So you want to be careful with that stuff. Liquid diamond, that's an epoxy resin. That doesn't have a strong odor to it, and that's very easy to work with. It's a nice resin to work with if you're doing feather blanks or watch blanks where you need a long open period to get all the air bubbles out of that stuff. So liquid diamond is my main source, or I'm sorry, Alumilite is my main source of resin that I use for all my castings. Here are a couple of pieces that has stabilized box elder burl, and this has wormy maple in it. Both of the woods in those two pieces have been stabilized with what they call sauce. It's a stabilizing resin that through the stabilizing process, you're first drying the blank completely. And until there's no measurable moisture in the blank. And then it goes into a vacuum chamber with this resin. And what it's going to do during the vacuum cycle is draw all the air out of the blank and replace it with the resin. Once it's gone through its soak period, you take and cure the wood blank in a oven of some sort of heating element. And what it's doing is basically turning the piece of wood into a plastic piece. That way, when you cast it with the Alumilite, there's no air in it, there's no moisture in it, and it's not going to affect your resin. So both of them pieces have stabilized wood in it. When you're doing your casting, like I was showing in the first half, you have a working period that you can mix your colors in, or first mix your resin together. It's typically a 2-part resin. So you're going to mix that up and then add your different mica powders and dyes. And you can search a week straight and find all different kinds of manufacturers for your mica powders, your dyes, pigments, and each one is going to give you a different characteristic in your casting. The mica powders are going to be opaque. Your pigments are a thicker liquid dye, so they're going to be opaque. The particles in the dye are thicker, so it makes it opaque. Your dye is going to be translucent. Now you can add enough dye to it that it's going to be dark enough and give you very minimal translucence in it, in your casting, but there's other ways to get to that point. Once you're mixed and ready to go into your molds, you have a variety of different molds that you can use. I use anything from the little 1-inch pen blanks that I had out before to block molds. This block mold will make 5 6-inch by 1-inch pen blanks. I have molds that I use for the vases, and they're actually old Tupperware canisters. So depending on what you want to do and the sizes that you want to do, there's a variety of molds out there that you can use. And you can make your own. The first couple of molds, when I first got into casting, went to a home supply store and bought a couple cutting boards. You can buy them white HPV cutting boards and cut your own blanks to make your molds out of it. What's nice about these is that there's no hardware. The ones that I made, I held everything together with screws. Over time, the screws stripped out. So then you're looking for inserts. It's nice though with these without having any hardware. I normally have a screwdriver and I just pop them open. And these are brand new molds. I just got these in this week. So that's, how they come apart. They're all tongue-and-groove fit. And I got these from Ken Bandley at Shed Life. Ordered them on Monday. By the end of the week, I had them. So I really like them. Like I said, once you have, your blanks in there, you just pop one end out, tap them a few times, your blank pops right out. Yes, sir.
Is that a tough one like the turkey?
Yeah, it's one of the things when, like on the hybrid blanks, I glue the burl pieces into the blank. It's very hard to get the hot glue to stick to it, so you're doing it multiple times. A lot of times, I do it maybe once a month. I'll take the blank, the mold, and I'll use a mold release, okay? I don't use a lot of it, and like I say, once a month I'll spray all my molds down, I'll clean some of the resin that's sticking to the top, I'll clean it all off. But yeah, it's like a Teflon material. You can pass it around.
Your mold release is silicone based? Silicone?
You know, I don't even know. This is one of the molds, or one of the release agents that Alumilite sells. And I don't know if people are familiar. Alumilite is, they have an outlet down in Kalamazoo. I've gone down there, and they're great people. I've talked to them on the phone, you know, a couple of times. Another great company to work with casting questions, they'll help you out. So, and they have a full range of mica powders and dyes also, so you can, you know,
What's the name of this store?
it's called Alumilite. Yep.
Ken in the back has a question?
Yes.
Could you explain briefly the differences between the Alumilite products? You're using Clear,
Yes.
Clear Fast or something, but explain a little bit the difference in them and how you would use them accordingly.
Okay. 95% of the time, for larger castings, my pen blanks, I use what they call Alumilite Clear Slow. It has a 12-minute working time. So that's going to allow me to mix the two parts together and mix either powders, pigments, or dyes into that before it has to go into the mold. Once you reach that 12-minute mark, your resin temperature is going to be rising that whole time. It's going to start its curing process. So once it gets above 95 degrees, it's starting to cure. The longer you wait to get it into your pressure pot, the more likely you're going to have air bubbles in your product. That is one of the things that it's walking that fine line between having a good casting and a bad casting and hard color separation. Okay. Alumilite Clear, this, it's a 7-minute working time. So you're cutting your working time now down in half. So you don't have, you know, the extra 6 minutes to get your stuff into the pot. So you want to keep your mixing to a minimal as far as the amount of colors that you're going to do. That's why when I did the demonstration, I only did 3 colors. You know, I don't have time to be mixing 4 or 5 colors like on some of the bigger pours that I've done, where I have 12 minutes. I could mix that up. I've done as many as 6 colors. Wendy, can you grab one of the abalone blends? They also have a product, it's called Alumilite White. That has a 2-minute working time, and that's the last thing that you're gonna mix, and the first thing you're gonna pour in and get it into the pot, because this bottle stop has 3 colors in it, and it's poured into the Clear Slow. What that's doing is giving me the hard color separation before it starts to set up, and it's allowing me to get it into the pot. So they call this effect the kaleidoscope effect, and I'll pass it around. And what I do is I have a 2x2 by 6 inch long mold, and I mix my Clear Slow up. I mix 10 ounces of that up, and I pour it into the mold as soon as I have it thoroughly mixed. I take the Alumilite White, and I already have my 3 colored dyes that I'm going to use in the little mixing cups. And these are just little Dixie mixing cups, plastic cups. You can use paper cups, but if you use paper cups, they have to be on wax on the inside. Otherwise, as you scrape the inside of the stir, the wax is getting inside of it and creating a contamination. So you want to make sure that they're on wax.
How many ounce cups are
These are 5-ounce cups. Yep. The larger ones that I use, these are 16. And then I have paint mixing cups. They're 1 quart size. So when I do bigger pours such as that, I can mix the whole thing all at once. And then I'll pour it off into the different colors and mix into here. So I'll do like, I believe those are 60 ounces, some of those 2 pours. So I'll mix 30 ounces in each of the quart cups and then pour off into that. That's allowing you to make sure you're getting a thorough mix with all your resin and it's being mixed all at the same time. You don't want 10 ounces going off 5 minutes before your last one. So that's critical because you'll still be mixing the last one up and this one's already at 100 degrees. So you're running around too much then trying to get them into the pressure pot. So those are the 3 different resins that I use from Alumilite Corporation. Yes?
Just to note that Alumilite is one that you can do large pours without having thermal problems, but some of the other resins, if you do more than like 1.5 inches at a time.
True, true. They generate more heat and you'll get what they call thermal cracking throughout your piece. So, yes, there's a lot of different factors depending on your project that you want to do. If you're doing a large flat piece like some of the river tables where you may only be an inch and a half thick, there's different epoxies that you can use for that. Liquid diamond is a epoxy resin. So that is not going to be affected as much by moisture in your piece. We do feather blanks for pens where we take and glue pheasant feathers to the brass tube and then we'll use a tube-in casting mold for the casting and I'll use the liquid diamond because that has a 24-hour curing process. And yes?
You know that I'm getting ready to start building pool sticks and I want to do this process, but what I need to know, how brittle is it?
The Alumilite, I mean, that you do that with an acrylic blank, it's going to break it up. That's, I mean, it's not, it's very strong. It's,
Because the guy that's working with me on teaching me how to do it, he doesn't do this yet, and he said to make sure we're highly concerned on, because you're knocking pool balls around with it.
yeah. That's, but you're stabilizing a piece of wood, so.
Yeah, but we're gonna do that to it too.
Okay, but you're not, it's also not a full piece of Alumilite unless you're doing something different. You're gonna cast it with the wood.
Whatever piece of wood we start turning, it's usually it's 1.5 inches square by 18 inches long. So if I put a piece of burl in and do what you did here, yeah, I would be doing it that way.
Yeah, so it's a combination of wood and
Yes.
the Alumilite. But yeah, your Alumilite, it doesn't have the, it's not as brittle as a polyester. Even your epoxy, resins, the liquid diamond, that is the same way. It almost will dent a little bit.
Okay.
So,
I was thinking this would work, and that's why I wanted to ask.
yeah.
Did you put it in the little pot there?
Yeah.
Gas,
Yeah, both of these. This one here?
yeah, you didn't fill that, you actually can't gas that big part in a mold.
Yes, yes. Yeah, it was like a, I don't know, roughly a 6-inch diameter Tupperware container, canister. And
Put something in the middle then too?
no, sometimes for my base lines, I made a plug out of the HPDE. So if I know what I'm going to do beforehand, I also do lidded boxes or bases with pine cones. I'll take and put that plug down in the center so I'm not using as much resin. Plus that helps hold your pine cones to the outside. So, this, the 32 ounce set was around 35 bucks, I believe. Now they have what they call a 16-pound kit, and that's 1 gallon of each A and B components. That's 160. So, and again, you know, depending on your different residents, you may have a little difference in price ranges. Mine doesn't last more than 6 months. You know,
I think Lumilight's is 1 year.
yeah, it could be. You know, I just got a gallon in and it's gone. When you're pouring 60 to 80 ounces in a base blank, you go through it pretty quick. And what I was saying before about your working time, okay? This blank has 6 different colors in it. It has your black, your interference green, interference purple or violet, interference blue, and a pearl white. So working with the Alumilite Clear Slow, it will give you time to mix all that. You know, as you first start out, you're thinking, oh my God, I don't have time. We used to make a mess over everything, and you're trying to pour it in the molds and get it in the pot. But as you start to develop a system, you realize, okay, do this, and you know, you get pretty efficient at it. So you have time to get the colors in there, and you can see the swirl patterns in them, where you got a nice separation of colors, where you don't get the muting together of the colors.
What kind of shrinkage rate do you have?
What kind of what?
Shrinkage rate do you have?
Very few, very little. That's what's nice about it.
What was the question?
Shrink rate.
Shrink
Big
rate?
rate, okay.
Yeah. Those pieces there were turned and cast last summer, so you won't feel any edges on that at all. Especially, what you're gonna get any type of shrinkage from is the wood, and that's gonna always wanna move. That's why you wanna use stabilized pieces and something like that, so your wood's not moving.
Do you have any problems with the binding process using a stabilized piece with any of the flex from the stabilization?
I haven't yet.
Okay.
That's one of the nice things too about the sauce is when it goes through its curing process, you have very little bleed out. So you don't have to scrape a lot of that excess resin off of your wood blank. Okay, if you do it correctly and run it through heat cycles, you get very, very little resin bleed out.
So are you saying this doesn't have the same crystallization process, problem with the extra juice?
No, that's why I use it. When I first started casting, I was buying pieces to cast with from people that like stabilize. And that was one of the things that I didn't like about cactus juice.
Yeah.
And I don't use it, so I'm not gonna say it's a bad product.
I think it's good for certain things, but if you have too many voids, it's gonna end up with little crystallized bits of the resin in there. That's no good.
This is a piece of maple burl that I stabilized. And that was, when it went into the vacuum tank, it was 1 pound, 10 ounces. And right now that weighs at just about 2 pounds, just over 2 pounds. So it gained 6.5 ounces, 7 ounces of resin from the stabilizing process. So
What product are you using?
it's called Sauce, SOS. I get that through Ken Bandelay at the Shed Life. That's on the handout. believe that's the top one on the handout.
See that for Sanders.
If you have any questions about it,
When somebody asks a question.
shoot him an
I see that so
email,
many
call him
times.
up. Like I said, I've asked a lot of questions about the process and that. He's a great guy to work with. Always,
That piece that you stabilized, would
Yeah.
you typically then just turn that, or would you add that to a resin part?
I'll add that to a resin casting. I'll make that, like these pieces here,
Sure,
I'll run that.
put it together.
Yeah.
Could you just turn that stabilized piece?
Yeah,
Would
sure.
you get a pretty nice, solid mass type?
Sure,
Okay.
sure. What it's gonna do is give your piece, especially if you have a piece that's breaking down, a lot of decay in it, it's gonna give it some
Body,
strength.
yeah.
So, yeah, it definitely will help that. Especially, I haven't tried it, but because I enjoy doing the casting. I have some bigger pieces of this Wormy maple that when I get the proper size tank to stabilize with, I'll do that with it. And, maybe down the road, I'll just take a piece of that by itself
Turn it.
and turn it.
So take just the stabilizing process, you're drying that, how are you drying that in the first place?
I'm drying it, and I bought an electric smoker just for my casting room.
Yeah.
What I do, because some guys, they'll put it in there and they'll run it 2-3 days without turning that thing off. Like everybody else, I have a 9-to-5 job. I'm not leaving that piece of wood in the oven while I'm gone. So I run it for 4 hours while I'm at home at 225 degrees. It shuts off, I go out in the morning, I make sure that it's off. And I write on the bottom of the piece how much it weighs the first day that I put it in there. Once it goes through a drying process and it will no longer lose any moisture weight, then I know it's ready for the stabilizing process. Once it goes into the stabilizing process, you're in a vacuum tank with the liquid resin, and what it's doing is drawing out all of the air in that piece of wood. With it being completely submerged, once you take that vacuum and turn it off, now the wood has essentially built the vacuum up in itself, and it's going to draw the resin back into where the air was, and replace the air with the resin. So if a piece of wood, like that large piece of maple, that was under vacuum for 3 days, 4 days, I double that time, and it'll soak for a minimal of 8 days. Once that time period is up, then I take and let it drain, and I'll put it in the oven in the smoker, and I'll start the curing process. And that's one of the nice things that's with the sauce, is that you can take and run it through heat cycles. So once it starts to build up temperature, it's going to start steaming. I take it out, set it on the workbench, let it start to cool down. What it's going to do is cure on the outside, and the resin that's on the inside is going to maintain it because it's building up kind of a protective shell on it. Instead of being in the cure or in the oven for the whole time, where you have to reach 190 degrees inside that block of wood for the resin to completely cure it. So it's building up a protective shell on the outside of the wood to maintain that resin inside of it, so you get a full stabilization of your piece. So that's one of the nice things with the sauce. I found that there's very little bleed out with it, and when you get into doing the colors of the piece, you can see how nice and deep the orange went, and this was a complete, a chunk of a burl cap. So I got good color all the way through that. So that's one of the things with the stabilizing. Yes, sir?
You're putting that resin into the vacuum.
Yep.
And for a certain length of time.
you know?
It's actually two questions here, two parts. Number one, does the length of time change how deep the migration is into the wood? And then, let's say if you were to take a 6-inch by 6-inch by 6-inch block of wood and put it there, does the migration penetrate over a period of time to the very center of the wood?
Yeah, that's what you're trying to achieve. Okay, when you're taking, and for example, that piece of maple, okay, when it goes under vacuum, you're pulling all the air out of it. So the best guess estimation that you have of that is the air bubbles coming out of your wood. So as soon as the air bubbles stop, you know that you've pulled all the air out of the block of wood that's in there. Once that happens, and that's why when you take it out, you know, when you weigh it, you know how much resin is left in that piece of wood. So that gives you kind of an idea if you got a good stabilization process. Okay. The other factor is how much color you get. You know, if you don't have, and again, some of your burls are going to be so dense, you know, like your Australian burls, you don't need to stabilize them because you're not going to be able to penetrate it. It just, they're so dense. The pen blanks that I have back there, none of the Australian burls were stabilized. You know, it's just, you dry it and get all the moisture out of it so you don't affect your casting process, and you know, you go from there. So, yes.
When you say you had it under vacuum for 3 days, is that vacuum running continually?
Continuous 24 hours.
3 days. It
Yep.
doesn't, it's not bad on the vacuum to be.
No, if you're going to get into it, don't buy a cheap vacuum motor. Yeah. You want to buy one that's rebuildable. They say don't take the main heart of your vacuum motor apart, but the JB Eliminator vacuum pump, I break that down, and every other cycle that I do, and I clean it. I mean, it'll build up so much junk in there, and you need to. And they tell you it'll avoid the warranty, but you know what? You're going to have so much crap in there, you know, they want to send it back. I break it down, and I rebuild it, and put it back together, and I haven't had a problem. So buy yourself a good pump. That I don't even remember. I bought it 2 years ago now. But they have different models. Like I said, you can either pay for it now or pay for it down the road. You know,
How many CFMs are you pulling?
I believe that was 4.3, if I remember correctly.
Does that matter, or?
No,
You can
because
pull one that's pulling 9.
the only thing that it's going to do is speed that process up. Because once you achieve full vacuum in your chamber, okay, and pull all that air out of it, your wood is going to dictate how fast it releases the air inside of it. So what I've been reading is that the number of CFMs, it's not as critical, because once you achieve, say, minus 25 to minus 30 on your vacuum, you're not going to pull anymore. So if you're pulling, you know, if your vacuum motor is rated for 4 or 9, it doesn't matter. You're at full vacuum for your elevation. That's all that matters. As long as you can achieve that, then...
It doesn't burn the motor up to sit there and not
Keep
be
the
able
motor
to.
running, I mean, you can't just shut the valve off, because it's not gonna.
No, because once you shut that off, you're not going to maintain full vacuum, because it's going to start pulling the air out of the wood. Okay, so until that is achieved and you have 0 air bubbles coming out of your wood, that vacuum is going to be depleted by the air coming out of the wood. Yeah, if you understand, you get that?
You just turn it on and let it.
Yep, let it run.
Does
You can add color to it, and that's one of the things that's nice with sauce also. My Aluminite dyes that I use for my casting, that is compatible with sauce. I believe they're also compatible with cactus juice, but again, I don't use that product. Ken is also coming up with his own line of dyes. He's got some really nice colors coming out just recently. One is a blood orange, and there was 4 different colors, like cardinal red, but they stay truer, and once they're in the wood, sometimes you'll see your colors fade a little bit from what you had in the stabilizing liquid. So. Yes, sir.
Do you use some kind of type of trap so that you're not sucking that stabilizing?
You should be, because like unfortunately we've had a couple of power outages when I've been running the vacuum, and what it does is draw that into your motor and it creates havoc. So yeah, if I ever find half an hour to build a small capture tank, it's a great idea. Seriously though, it's one of them things that you don't think of until your motor quits for whatever reason. And it seemed like the first 2 times that I ran my vacuum tank, we had power outages. I'd come home and there'd be a ½ inch of oil that the tank actually reverse vacuums out of the motor. It'll have that much draw to it that it pulls the oil out of the motor, and you're wasting a quart of resin, because now it's contaminated with the oil from your motor, and now your motor has resin sucked into it, which, because of the heat in the motor that builds up, is going to start curing, and it gums everything up. So that's why I say, buy yourself a good rebuildable motor vacuum pump.
One thing I found when I was looking for my pump is there's pumps out there that you don't have to put oil in. You want one that you do put oil in, because that keeps the temperature down on when you're running them.
Yes, yeah, and that's all part of the rebuildable factor. I mean, the oil that you put into that, it's not just a regular, 5-weight motor oil. It's made for vacuum pumps. I use JB Gold. It has a couple different detergents and an anti-foaming agent in it, so as the pump is running, it's not creating a slurry in there. So, yes?
Have you tried the microwave doing the final process? Instead of the oven? Sorry, to cure it, that's the word I was looking for.
Yeah, no.
I know Ken's been playing with it, he's been posting a lot on his Facebook page about that.
Yeah, well, what he's doing is he's doing the wood drying part of it.
No, he's actually curing the SOS with the microwave.
Okay, that I didn't see. I knew he was doing some experimenting with drying the wood, but I didn't know that he was...
I think the drying the wood kind of made him think like maybe I can cure it, so he tried it with pen lights. I guess he said he was turning the microwave down to like halfway.
Yeah.
And then it was taking 5 minutes to cure a pen light.
Yeah. I know that he has a couple of plans that he wants to develop a whole all-in-one system.
Right.
So,
You
yes.
ever use a vacuum for burning?
No. One, I don't want the moisture going into the vacuum pump, because then you're going to be rebuilding it. It's going to contaminate the oil in the vacuum pump. Because you got to remember, whatever's coming out of your vacuum chamber is going into your pump. So that's going to contaminate the oil and create havoc with it.
Do they sell like a separator tank?
I'm sure they do. It's one of the things that I just haven't. Yeah. It's roll the dice and see what happens. I'm gonna release the pressure in this and we'll see how our pen blanks look. And one of the things too, I seen, it was from a while ago, somebody, if you look at the top of the pot, you can see the indentations from where I keep on clamping down. Somebody thought it would be a good idea to epoxy small metal blocks onto their lid to keep that from happening. Well, what had happened was one of the clamps, I don't know if it was at an angle or what, but he filled it up and walked away, and he heard a loud explosion. And what had happened was one of the blocks, they figured twisted off and the lid went flying. Yeah, and he said that he had to go change his drawers afterwards. So it's one of them things, again, you know, altering and plugging the holes on top is one thing, but taking and doing other modifications to it, be smart about it. Think about what you're doing and using this thing for. We have a screwdriver here. That's one thing I forgot to bring. A screwdriver? Oh, I got it. You can see the color separation now. I don't know if the camera's picking it up, but how the translucent blue is in that. But that's, you know, decent color separation in that too. You know, your colors aren't muddled together. But you can, I'll pass this around, you can feel, you know, it still has a softness to it. So it needs to fully cure yet.
So how long does it take to cure it?
Typically, I mean, if you wanted to, you could take that blank and turn it. And you can see too, you know, there's no air bubbles at all.
If you wanted to make a solid single color, would that be doable, or do you think you'd see more chance of bubbles in there?
Oh, no, because when you put it into the pressure pot, you're crushing them. What you're actually doing is crushing the bubbles to a microscopic level where you can't see them. It's not, when they're under pressure, it's not pulling the air out of it. You know, it's just crushing it down. Yep.
Do you have a little more grace in terms of the time after you poured it into the form between that, getting the pot set up and pressurized?
Say that again?
How urgent is it in your time frame to get it in the pot after it's poured?
That's all determined by the type of resin that you're using. So some of them, like the Clear Slow I typically use, that has a 12-minute working time. This has a 7-minute working time. So that's going to dictate you have 7 minutes versus the 12 minutes.
So it's 7 minutes from
the time you start mixing them together
to pressure.
To pressure. Yep.
It needs to be at least somewhat liquid when it goes in the pot, otherwise those bubbles will already have set in the resin.
Yeah, you don't want to wait until your 7 minutes is up because now your curing process is starting. When it says 7-minute working time, you know, the longer you play with that, yeah, the better color separation you're going to have. but then you're gonna have the risk of air bubbles. And your weather, that all comes into effect. During the summertime, if you have, a hot, humid day, it's gonna set that resin off that much faster. I've had it where I started mixing and within 5 minutes, it was starting to set up. I'm like, it was 85, 90 degrees and, 100% humidity.
And moisture is counterintuitive in that too. The
Yes.
less moisture, it slows the cure time.
Yeah, well, what it's gonna do is add moisture to your casting, and you're gonna have air bubbles from the moisture in it. It's good. Any other questions? Yes?
That was still, when you poured it into the bowl, that was still actually, still creating heat, correct?
Yes.
So then when you put it in the pressure pot, does the heat keep going? Or does
Oh, yes, yeah, it'll still keep going. You can feel, like, this mold here, you can still feel some of the heat in that. So as far as how hot they actually get, I don't know, but there's quite a bit of heat built up. And like we were discussing before, some of your epoxies, you can't pour them that thick because they'll build up so much heat that it'll get thermal crack. Yes, sir?
Why don't you use a 3/4 by 3/4 pen blank?
Because when you see the pen blanks, you'll see how the corners round out. You get, if your pot isn't sitting perfectly level, okay, you're gonna get little defects like that into it. So you're gonna wanna trim your blanks up. And, if you're doing it for yourself, you can actually use PVC pipe, 3/4 inch diameter PVC pipe and pour in that. And that's a whole nother technique of pouring a vertical mold versus a horizontal mold. So you want to have a little extra for trimming and getting rid of any imperfections. So, any other questions?
To treat a crack in the bowl, and you use the bowl as a mold.
Yeah, you could. For something like that, I would recommend using a epoxy resin. Right, not Palomite, liquid diamond, because what you can do is put, say, if the blank has already been dried, okay, and you return it and you notice that there's the crack in it, you can pour that liquid diamond into it. I've used that to fill voids and pour directly into it. And if the bowl is small enough, you can put it into, like I have the smoker, I've put them into the smoker to help the curing process. So otherwise, it takes a while for that to cure in the wood. And it's not going to be affected by the moisture in the wood, like the aluminum wood.
Yeah, I got a dumb question. Are bubbles always bad? Have you ever turned something with bubbles in it and made something out of it?
Yeah, you can. Typically, they're small. They're pinholes. Because I have all the colors and I'm doing the casting, what I'll do is fill the hole with CA, and then just whatever color, I try to match it up, and I'll just smear the mica powder into it.
Oh.
If they're larger voids, I have a regular 2-part epoxy, that you would use for bonding, and I'll mix the mica powders into that and fill it like that. I've had it where a piece is cracked on me, and I'll just take and fill it with whatever mica powder color.
But you never leave them in to a finished pin barrel that you give to people you don't like or something?
No. Can't say that I have. I had, I don't know if you're familiar with sweet gum pops. They're, size of a gumball, quarter. and they have all these little spines all around them. They use them for casting, and I don't know why I do it, because they look really cool as a pen blank, but it's so hard to get the air bubbles out of them. And I did a block mold for them, wherever the block mold went to.
Oh, it's floating
This
around.
here. You know, I laid them all in there, and then I poured, you know, a 3-color pour of resin on it. And I still ended up, even though I poured it early to get it into the pressure pot, to give it a chance to work all the air bubbles out, they still had air bubbles. It's one of them things that I haven't been able to figure out how to get the air out of them. But they look really cool, so I have 5 blanks that I'll be filling in and, you know, taking care of them. So, yes?
Could you ever do a vacuum instead of a pressure to pull the air bubbles out, so it can come to the surface?
No, there's a whole lot of different reasoning behind that. When Alumilite, on their directions and on their pamphlets, they'll say that you can take each part individually before you mix them and degas them in a vacuum. But because I think you're adding so much air when you do the mixing, and your time constraint, you know, depending on what type of resin you're using, you don't have time to put it in the vacuum chamber. Then you're going to pour it into your mold, and you know, so it's, you know, timing and.
I was just wondering if once it's in the mold, could you vacuum instead of pressure?
Well, one, you would need a lot larger vacuum chamber. Okay, the largest that I have right now is a 8-inch, and I believe that the vacuum would take longer, so that's why you're better off just to crush it, crush the air bubbles into it.
Any thoughts versus hand stirring versus a power mixer?
Depending on the size of your pour, you can, because again, you're going to cast under pressure. You know, if you're using Alumilite, it doesn't matter how much air you introduce into it. You know, we use large rubber spatulas when we do the larger pours and really mix that up so that you get a good mix. But yeah, you could take and, you know, I've seen guys, they take a little paint mixer and put it in a cordless drill, you know, and mix it that way. You know, so, yes.
You can use a torch on the surface to get the air bubbles.
For your epoxies, yes. No, not for Alumilite. That for an epoxy resin, yes. You got to remember, when you start heating that up, the faster the curing process is going to take place. That would help you also with your bubbles along your seams. So if you're using an epoxy, yes, you can. If you're using Alumilite, you're just going to make it cure faster and capture them bubbles that much faster.
If you're using epoxy and you wanted to put some color in it, what's the best coloring technique for epoxy?
The same.
Just the dyes?
Yep, okay. Your dyes, your pigments, mica powders, and like I say, there's, you know, I like the Color Fusion powders from Oak Brook. There's a guy down in Florida, Divine Pigments, I think is the name, Braxton, he sells. There's, I mean, there's so many different companies making colors, powders and stuff. So.
Do you recommend using like a sealer on the wood before you cast the Alumilite to it?
I don't, because I'm stabilizing it. So I know some guys, they use an epoxy. What type of, you know, if it's just a regular bonding epoxy or maybe like a marine epoxy. That I don't know. Yes?
If you used grass shavings and 2-part epoxy before, can something like that be used with Alumilite?
I didn't hear the first.
Grass shavings, I've used that with 2-part epoxy before.
Yeah. Brass shavings, I've tried to mix it a couple of times, but they all end up at the bottom of the mold. So you gotta be very careful with that.
Rotisserie.
Yeah. Keep them suspended.
Yeah, it's one of them things that, you know, I waited as long as I could, and I poured them in. Aluminum shavings, they worked really well. Okay, but brass, yeah. Now see, I have some really large brass pigtails that I have. It's actually nautical brass, so it won't tarnish. But I've had a hard time with the resin bonding to it. When I start turning the pen points, it pops off of it. So, yeah. It's one of the things I haven't had a chance to try acid wash the brass yet. So, we'll get there.
All right, let's give Brady a big hand. Thank you all for coming. If you have more questions, come on up here, Father Brian, as he's trying to back up.